Sorry about that. I think all of your questions have been answered, Howard. And again, I have to apologize for last month because I didn't warn you that the 40 minutes was running out. So yeah, I'm sure everybody just got cut off at the end. So I guess you're going to make another presentation this month. So take it away.
Okay, good. Yeah, we'll kind of start over. We got more people, so that'll help make it complete for the people that weren't on, hams that weren't on from the last month. But my thought was to review multimeters and talk about what they can do and where you can get them and so forth. So modern multimeters measure voltage and volts and resistance and ohms and current and amperes. And some multimeters, as Joe mentioned, measure other things like diodes, transistors, even capacitors. I know Radio Shack made one that you could even measure capacitors. All modern multimeters have a digital display, and the inexpensive ones have a function knob as well to dial in what measurement you want to read and the relative amount of that measurement. They're more expensive ones, like the one Joe has. If you want to measure ohms, it'll automatically decide what range to utilize, so you don't have to flip the dial around to determine what range you need. Be nice to have one of those, but the inexpensive ones work pretty good. This is one that is from Harbor Freight. I didn't really, at the time, they were giving away these as promotional items. Now I think they're about $7 or $8, and I got a flyer the other day that they had them for $4.95, so on sale. In the past, old school meters were available, and they were often referred to as volt ohm meters, or if they had a tube in there to increase the accuracy, they were called vacuum tube voltmeters. And those are still useful if you have one handy. They can perform a similar function with analog metering. Last time I showed an old Simpson Model 260, which was kind of a classic volt ohm meter. I didn't bring it upstairs tonight. Multimeters are the basic test instrument for amateur radio operators to have, and no ham should be without one. That's a kind of a big statement, but I believe it to be true. Inexpensive multimeters, also handy to put in your go box. It's not that big. You can stick it in there, check out an antenna, check out batteries, check out continuity and so forth out in the field, which is pretty handy. So where could you go to purchase a multimeter? I mentioned Harbor Freight. Amateur radio stores have multimeters. There sometimes you can get some of the higher featured multimeters at radio stores. Amazon, Lowe's. or examples. I looked on Amazon, and they had some nice multimeters. They weren't priced too high, and they had pretty good ratings. So if you're on Amazon and you don't want to travel around and look at anything, you can buy one over Amazon. I think their entry level multimeter was about $13. So how to use a multimeter. I always say getting started, read the directions carefully. Believe it or not, they'll give you a lot of information about your multimeter. You'll probably learn something. Most of the time, you'll need to install a battery in your multimeter to get it going. Most of the small ones that I've come across just use a regular little 9-volt battery. I wouldn't go cheap on the batteries. Get a Duracell or a good quality battery, because you don't want it leaking inside the multimeter, and you might try to change it out every couple of years before it does start to leak and corrode the unit. And this is true with any electronic equipment. Be safe if working on live circuits, particularly. Know the voltages you're working with. Most of the literature I've read say if you've got over 30 to 40 volts, you should be concerned, about being careful. When I'm testing higher voltages, I use some test leads, which are handy to have, and you can pick them up at the swap meets pretty easily. Buy a set of test leads with alligator clips. They have fancier ones you can use as well. It have little prongs that press in and so forth. But I always use those test leads and then hook my multimeter onto that, and then turn the equipment on, so that I've never touched anything inside the radio, and I've never touched the multimeter, because if you make a mistake with a multimeter, they could go up with smoke while you're holding it in your hand and get pretty hot. So be careful. These multimeters are pretty interesting, but you need to have some idea what you're testing. Are you testing DC volts or AC volts, alternating current? If you're measuring amperage, there's some on most of these little small units, they have a special plug to measure the amperage. If you just leave it in the common positions that you use for most things, try to measure any amount of amperage, you'll burn up the meter. So, you don't want to embarrass yourself by not being careful on how to use the meter. Again, read the directions carefully on how to use the unit. That's about where I ended last time. So here's where we start some new material. Sources of information on use of multimeters. Where can you find out information? Use the internet as a resource. Lots of YouTube videos are available on how to use a multimeter. Just type in how to use a multimeter and you'll have more than you can read about. Books, including ARRL publications, can be useful. I picked up for a quarter an old book at the swap meet, 101 Ways to Use Your Volt Ohm Meter and Vacuum Tube Voltmeter. It's an old school book, but it has a lot of interesting things you can do with a voltmeter is the basic test instrument. You may need to add a few parts and pieces, but you can do a lot of testing with a voltmeter. And you can always ask for help from other hams, especially those who've been in the hobby for a while, on how to use a meter or what you can do with it if you have a question or a problem you need to solve. So I've just written down a few of the examples of how I've used multimeters. I heard somebody on the air tell me this the other day, and I thought, yeah, I've done that before. Checking AC line voltage and grounds. Very useful for that purpose. Check DC power supply output voltages. How much does your power supply put out? Is it low in voltage or is it high? You may find out there's a way to adjust your voltage in a power supply that might power your handy talkie or a mobile radio or your HF radio. Often I check DC power supply output voltages on equipment, sometimes old tube equipment. And that's again where I'm very careful using some test leads and not to get my hands in the radio there with the leads on the multimeter, because boy, this just broke off. Anyway, so now I need a little soldering job, but here's a positive test lead. And all you need to do is slip in there a little bit inside a piece of equipment, and you can find yourself in a lot of trouble. And that's why I'm always very, very careful. Checking batteries. That's something you can do. And I was curious when Joe talked about the batteries getting old, whether the voltage had dropped on the battery system. I would have been curious about that, but maybe he would have to go with his multimeter up there and measure the battery output under load, some type of load. Checking light bulbs, around your house. You think, oh, well, I got a light bulb problem up in the ceiling, and sometimes it's a matter of continuity or a light fixture that's gone bad. And I always use my ohm meter to check for continuity on light bulbs, and I find a lot of times it isn't the light bulb, it's a problem internally in the socket, or just a bad connection where I might clean up the light bulb and it'll work fine again. So let's see what else I've got here. Checking coax for continuity and shorts. It's not the only way to check coaxial cable, but it's pretty basic, and you can check both ends of it, and check the center conductor, and you can check the ground cable, and you can sometimes wiggle the coax around. Sometimes you find that the job you thought was so good on soldering or crimping the coax connector wasn't so hot. It's easy to fix when it's not all plugged in or up on the tower. Do it in your house. You can check electrolytic capacitors for shorts and leakage. You can check resistor values. And older equipment, resistor values often go up in resistance, a resistor. So you can read the code out on the resistor and then check the resistance, see if it's within the parameter that you need. You know, if it's a 10% resistor, is the resistance more than 10%? Sometimes they'll go real high on some older equipment. These little Centec have a spot there for checking transistors, and both NPN and PNP. So that's pretty handy. I have checked a transistor or two, so that proved to be a handy help to me. You can check tubes for filament continuity and shorts. It's not perfect, but it's not a tube tester. But if you don't have a tube tester, certainly that's a way to do some basic testing on a tube. Before you put it in a radio, you might as well find out if the filaments are open or closed, and if there's shorts that could damage your equipment. Somebody was talking to me yesterday about an old piece of equipment, and they said it had a lot of cold solder joints in it. So I think, and you know, a little simple multimeter setting their resistance positions could check that out pretty fast to see if it's open between the device and the connection. So anyway, if anyone has some other that's on here on our Zoom meeting, any other use of multimeter they'd like to describe, we can open it up. Or if there are any questions I've talked about this evening, that'd be great. And if there's really any interest in doing some actual testing with a multimeter, if you've never had that experience, I'd be glad to host an in-person class to do some training on use of the multimeter. So that's where I'm at, Mr. President. So if we have a minute, I'd like
demo items I can do if you want.
Okay.
All right. So first rule, and I'm not sure. I got to be able to see what I'm sending here. Hang on. Am I on here? Yeah, there we are.
Yes.
So
you
there's a multimeter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing you'll notice is there's three red circles here and one black one.
Mm-hmm.
The black one is labeled common. The black lead always goes in there. However, the important thing of this demo is the red lead goes in one of these three red circles, depending on what you're doing. So if you put it in this one over on the right, like that, that one says ohms, volts, and millivolts, and it has a little diode symbol there too. So for testing all those things, you use that one. And these two are for testing current. So on this particular meter, there's one for up to 440 milliamps, and there's one for up to 10 amps.
Yeah.
A lot of meters only have one for amps.
On these little cheap ones, there's a 10 amp position
Right.
here at for the thing.
So I vaporized one of those cheap ones by having that thing plugged into volts and ohms and taking these two probes and putting them into a 110 volt electric socket. The meter literally exploded in flames. It's not supposed to do that. It's supposed to have a fuse. But when you buy your meters at Harbor Freight, you don't get to be picky. So anyway, so that's my important safety tip. Always make sure you know what the red probe is connected to before you stick the red probe, especially in anything that's got a lot of voltage or current. And then
there have been some, you know, cases where people have gotten injured with improper use of a multimeter, and I suppose the Harbor Freight one's probably more notorious for having some safety problems. But if you're careful using them and have some idea what you're dealing with, I think you can use Harbor Freight with reasonable safety. But
Yeah, so I wanted to show a couple of other accessories you can use with a voltmeter, with a multimeter. The first thing is you don't have to limit yourself to the probes that came with the meter. These are actually really nice probes that came with this meter, but you can get probes that look like this that have like a point, a tip that's just a point, right? You can get different size points on here. And I think actually this one unscrews like that. So you can change out the tip on it. Or the other thing about this one, and I'm sure you can't see this, is when you unscrew that little collar, there's actually a little hole in there that goes through the meter. So you can actually take a wire, stick it through there and screw this collar back down. And then you're connected, you know, reasonably well to that wire. So you don't have to sit there and keep holding the thing and you know, lose contact and all that stuff. So if you're actually doing a lot of measurements, that's actually a really useful thing, is to have a probe that actually you can connect to the wire. The other way to do that is to use a probe like this one that has an alligator clip on the end of it. I don't know if you can see the alligator clip, right? So I have a couple of these that have probes on there. And then the other thing is actually kind of cool is this is a temperature probe. This actually goes with the fluke meter I have. And what this has is these two guys right here, the two prongs in there, they go in to a regular voltmeter, including this one. You can just stick them in there. And on the other side, you have a socket that has a thermocouple, an industry standard thermocouple plug on it, which is this yellow thing. And so you can stick a thermocouple. This is a air probe that I have in my hand here. So you take that off of there, you wave this around or put it into a fan or an air conditioner or something like that. And you can use that to determine your meter will read out in millivolts the exact number of degrees F or C, depending on how you set the switch, that the thermocouple is reading. So it corrects for the thermocouple value, and it also turns it into 0 to 100 millivolts, so that the meter will just read like 70 when it's 70 degrees on the end of the probe. So that's actually a pretty cool accessory for a meter. This is an air probe, which is used for like measuring air streams. I have a water probe in the air, and then this is just a naked thermocouple. So it's got the industry standard thermocouple plug on the yellow plug, goes in there on the bottom of that, and then on the other end, somewhere here, just at the end of this wire, there's the here it is. Yeah, there's a little tiny thermocouple junction right at the end of that wire. And you can stick that on something or tape it on something and measure surface temperature or, you know, whatever with that. So this is called a thermocouple module. And it's actually designed to go in a voltmeter to make a voltmeter be able to measure temperature. Some voltmeters have this function built into them. So they have, like, somewhere on the meter, there'll be the two little blade socket for a thermocouple plug. And they have it built in. But this is a pretty cool thing that Fluke does. I have used this a lot. Like every time I work on an air conditioner, or I put it inside my freezer to find out how I take this thing and run it through the side of my freezer to make sure my freezer is working well and stuff like that. And it's actually incredibly useful. So
you could use that to tell when your turkey's done at Thanksgiving.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
I don't have a thermocouple probe that you can put it in an oven, like that will go that high temperature. You have to use a different kind of thermocouple for that. And you can't use this funky thermocouple wire that's got plastic on the outside of it, because it'll melt.
No.
But I used to work in process control, so I used to use all kinds of different thermocouples. But this one probably actually came from the company, actually. But like I said, there's a bunch of accessories that plug into voltmeters. The thermocouple probe is one of them. And so multimeters are actually more useful than even what they do natively.
And some of them, one other probe that's kind of handy, and I have one for for a Simpson, an old Simpson voltmeter is a high voltage probe.
Yeah,
You know, if you want to measure 2000 volts in your linear amplifier, see what the plate voltage is coming off that transformer, they're pretty handy to have.
yeah.
But
The other thing they
so there's-
sometimes have is the current probe. It looks like a little clamp, and you put it around a
Yep.
wire, an AC wire, and you can measure how much current's going through the wire without actually interrupting the wire.
I think, Don, you've got one of those.
A lot of times those are on a separate meter though, They
Clamp
have
on
an ammeter.
for power lines.
I have a separate clamp on amp meter for AC and DC.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought I'd show some accessories.
Anyone else have a unique use of a multimeter that we haven't talked about? Looking up and down the pictures here on the screen. Okay, Paul, I guess we've covered the ground on multimeters tonight. And if, like I say, if anyone is interested in establishing a little multimeter class, we could certainly do that. You know, we've got Joe, myself, Don, and many others that could participate and show some newcomers on how to use this equipment. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Howard. That was wonderful. I've only I've had a multimeter for years, but I've only used it to check the my AA and AAA batteries to see if they're any good. That's all I've used it for. But you know, checking a radio is is a good idea. So
Yeah,
I
a
have
lot
a
of
question.
times you'll get, like, if you're looking at a piece of equipment, you look at the schematics for it. A lot of times you'll get on the schematics, it'll actually have a test point and it'll have a voltage next to it. And it'll say like 10.7 volts or something. So that's when you can use, a voltmeter to actually do debug on complex equipment, because you can go through the test points and make sure they have all the right voltage that it says on the schematics that they have. And sometimes you can identify what part of the equipment has a problem that way.
Very true. Heathkit was when they designed kits, they always had a page with all the various voltage points to check. They were pretty famous for that because they knew kit builders would make some mistakes.
all right, a great presentation. Thank you, Howard, and thank you, Joe. Great presentation as usual. Does anybody have any questions about what we've covered during the whole meeting? Hearing none, I have one question for Joe. The world's largest truck stop is in, I believe it's Iowa, where on I-80. I've been past there a couple of times, and I believe it's in Iowa, right?
Iowa 80. It's about 8 or 9 miles from the border with Illinois.
Right. Yeah. I remember that.
I've driven across the country a whole bunch of times recently, and so I almost always, at least in one direction, I stop at Iowa 80 when I do that.
Okay. Yeah. I used to drive to Toronto every year, so I've always gone up I-80, and I remember going past that. That place was huge.
I don't know if it's actually the largest truck stop in the world, but it's pretty
right.
big. It's a truck stop and it's really big. So
yes. Yeah. All right. Does anybody have any questions about anything that we've covered, or any questions in general? Well, hearing none, I want to thank everybody for participating tonight, and stay cool. That's all I can say. Stay cool. All right. And thank you again. And we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Good.